through it, and Rachel Heiss from the Department of Legislative Services will walk us through, I believe, the entire bill and all the amendments that have come through Senate committees and from the Senate floor. To you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with Ways and Means. This is, as you know, I think one of the most important bills we have this year, and it's the first step to, I think, we hope, a great bill that will pass next year that will address many of the recommendations, if not all of them, from the Kerman Commission. So, speaking of first steps, we'll let Rachel take it away.
So everyone should have a copy of the third reader version of Senate Bill 1030 at your desk. If you don't, holler, because you will be lost.
You need to talk closer to the mic. I know you have a lot of papers there, too.
It's
Thank
okay.
you.
I can do it. Okay. So starting with the first page of the bill, you can see that the Senate altered the title of the bill and added the word education before blueprint. On the next several pages are technical amendments that reflect the other changes to the bill that we're going to be discussing. So then, turning to page 5, this is the part of the bill that contains what is called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. And the Senate did have a couple of amendments on page 6 relating to, in lines 29 and 30, this amendment broadens the description of the pre-kindergarten program that is envisioned. There was a concern that the Commission has recommended a sliding scale for kids who are above between 300 and 600% of poverty for 4-year-olds. There was a concern that this language didn't reflect that. Rather than trying to reflect it, they went the other way and just made it a little broader so that it's just a statement about expanding access to high-quality full-day pre-K for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds through a mixed delivery system without getting into the who's going to pay and who's not going to pay. On page 7, and actually the real amendment is the top of page 8, relates to CTE programs, and in line 2, this is really just technical. 1 and 2, it just sort of reversed it. So instead of saying a workplace experience or an apprenticeship, it flips it around and says an apprenticeship or other workplace experience, which is apparently the term of art. And then in lines 5 through 7, this is an amendment that was added in the EHE committee that just reflects there was a concern, some of you I think have probably are aware of it, about the agricultural education programs were concerned that they weren't going to fit into the new blueprint. So this is some language that just makes it clear that we certainly still want to have agricultural education programs. So those are the changes to the blueprint part of the bill. I don't know, I'm assuming everyone's familiar with the blueprint itself, but if you want me to go into more detail on that, I could do that. Moving on. Okay. So, I mean, just in very briefly, the blueprint reflects the broad recommendations of the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, the 5 policy areas that the Commission is making recommendations in, which are early childhood education, high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, college and career pathways and readiness, students who need additional resources, and accountability. And so those 5 policy areas are encompassed in this first section in the blueprint. On page 9, and on another page as well, but on page 9 at the bottom, the change to in lines 21 in line 21, and then again down in 26 and 27. This reflects a change that is needed because the current CPI index that is used in calculating the foundation program no longer exists. The Washington-Baltimore metropolitan area no longer is collected as a single unit. They've split it into the Washington area and the Baltimore area. And so last session, the Department of Legislative Services, the Department of Budget and Management, and MSDE, the State Department of Education, were asked to look at the two options and make a recommendation as to which was the better fit. We all agreed that the Washington area index was a better fit, both because it actually is, we use the July measure is typically what's used in the transportation formula. The July measure is being reported for Washington. It is not being reported for Baltimore, so that's one reason. The other reason is when we looked at the historical data, the trend between the new Washington index and the existing Washington-Baltimore index matched much more closely. And so this change is here. It is also for the transportation formula in a few pages. On page 11, the underlying bill is extending the declining enrollment grants that have been funded since fiscal 2018 for an additional year through 2021. And this provides additional funding to counties based on whether their most recent enrollment count or their rolling 3-year average is higher, and we use the higher one. So we wanted to make sure that money was in the budget in fiscal 2021. Then starting on the bottom of page 11, this is one of the new programs that I'm going to shorthand it, the Kerwin Commission is recommending, and this is the Concentration of Poverty School Grant Program. The Commission recommended providing additional funding for schools that have a concentration of over 55% of students in the school who are eligible for free or reduced price meals. For the first year, the Commission recommended starting with 80% of schools that have an 80% concentration of poverty. And that is what is reflected in this section. The Senate altered the bill so that for the first year, the data that is being used is the data that the Commission used to develop its cost estimates, which is based on the October 2017 data, which is for the 2017-2018 school year. At the time that the Commission was making its recommendations, the next school year's data was not available. That data is now available for the 2018-2019 school year. And so what the Senate did is they allowed the data for 2018-19, the more recent data, to be used for the fiscal 21 funding. Right now in the bill, it's sort of frozen at the same schools and the same funding level in fiscal 20 and 21. So this lets it float if more schools become eligible based on the more recent data for fiscal 21. Long term, for the bigger bill, I think we need to do a little more thinking about what the right timeline is in terms of how much the data should float from year to year. Because what the Concentration of Poverty Grant is providing is it's providing additional resources to these schools in the form of a community school coordinator and then a healthcare practitioner, a somatic health care practitioner who would be so that there is coverage in that school during all school hours, including any extended school hours in that school. And so they would be hiring these positions. If they already have these positions, which some schools do, then they're allowed to use the money that's being provided in this first phase-in year toward doing a needs assessment, which is required, of the needs of the students in the schools in terms of, and you can see on page, anybody sees it, please tell me. On page 15, subsection E, it says the community school coordinator shall be responsible for establishing the community school and completing an assessment within a year of the needs of the students in the school and the appropriate wraparound services that are needed in that school. And then you can see that the Senate amended the language there to clarify that the assessment will be done in collaboration with the school principal, the healthcare practitioner in the school, and the parent and teacher organization in the school. So that needs assessment. Also in Roman 2 there in lines 16 to 18, it includes an assessment of the physical, behavioral, and emotional health needs of students, as well as their families and their communities. So that needs assessment will be done. And then the wraparound services, which are listed on, back on page 12, are defined there, what the wraparound services are, and the Senate made a few changes to that language. And so the dollars can be used to provide these wraparound services if they're not needed in this first year or the second year for those two positions. In the future, as the program is phased in further, which is not in this bill right now, there will be per student funding provided to each eligible school that would be available to pay for the wraparound services. And also right now, the threshold in this bill is 80% of poverty. Over time, that would come down to 70%, and then ultimately any school that had a concentration above 55% of poverty. On page 13, under subsection C, shows that the grant amount for each school is $248,833, and that again reflects what the estimated cost that was used to provide those two positions. And the monies are intended to go to the eligible school. In the middle of the page, though, in lines 21 through 25, it clarifies that if in the systems that have a large number of schools that are eligible for this grant, that would be some economies of scale in sharing the resources.
What page you're on right now?
13.
Thank you.
The middle of the page, subsection C, and then in lines 21 to 25, language was added that allows the school system that has more than or at least 40 eligible schools to develop a plan that would allow some of those resources, which are intended to go directly to the school to be spent at the school level. It would allow those funds to be essentially shared among eligible schools so that the services are delivered in the most efficient way possible. And that for the first year, 2 years, those two school systems are Baltimore City and Prince George's County. In lines 26 through 28, it also shows that as part of this, the Department of Education would receive a new position to be a director of the community schools to provide the coordination and technical assistance at the state level. Then on the bottom of 13 and on to page 14 talks about the two positions, the community school coordinator and the healthcare practitioner that I've mentioned, and it sort of defines that healthcare practitioner who would be providing coverage would have to be a licensed physician, licensed physician's assistant, or a licensed registered nurse. That definition only applies to the practitioner that is going to be providing the coverage. Further below, the wraparound services may be provided by other types of healthcare practitioners, which in other parts of the code is a very much broader definition. It includes social workers, psychologists, all sorts of people. And this language does not preclude the hiring of those other types of people. And then I think the next sort of thing to point out at the bottom of page 14 just clarifies that if a position that we're talking about providing to an eligible school is already being provided by the county board through its budget, that they have to continue doing that they can't supplant, essentially. And then on page 15, we've talked about the assessment. So I think the last piece is in subsection F, which is lines 19 through 23. And what this says is there are a number of counties where the school nurse or the school health services are provided through the county's Department of Health rather than giving the funds through to the school system. So what this language says is for those counties, both for the school health services and the community school services, if they're providing those services in fiscal 2019, they have to continue to provide them in fiscal 20 and fiscal 21. So that covers the concentration of poverty grant program. At the bottom of page 15 is the other instance where we are updating the CPI index to the Washington metropolitan area, and this is for the student transportation formula. On page 16, in section 5207, this language, what the bill is doing is it's extending a program that exists in current law for schools and school systems that participate in the community eligibility provision that allows schools to provide free meals if they achieve a certain threshold of poverty in that school. We've had a sort of a hold harmless in place since fiscal 17, so that for the compensatory education formula, which relies on data being reported on free and reduced price meals, for those school systems and schools that are no longer necessarily counting those kids because they don't need to, we have a hold harmless in place that is allowing, so it's allowing these schools and school systems, and 5 or 6 of them are now whole school systems are participating in the program, to go ahead and access the program that allows them to give free meals to all their students, which is a good thing, but at the same time not be harmed in the state funding formula because they're doing that. So what we're doing in the bill is extending that provision for 3 more years to 2025, just to be safe in case we need it that long. If we need it, if we don't need it sooner, we will repeal it. We can repeal it. On page 17, this deals with full day pre-K. And what the bill is doing, or what the commission has recommended, is to start to incentivize school systems to move to provide full day pre-K for their 4-year-olds. And so we've had since fiscal 2018 a grant program that provides funding to school systems that are providing full day pre-K to all of their 4-year-olds. All of the 4-year-olds that they enroll are in full day. What this bill does is it says if you have any 4-year-olds in full day pre-K, we will provide some funding to you. And so the bill does that, and it also extends the existing and now new formula throughout for one more fiscal year to fiscal 2021. Ultimately, what the commission has recommended is moving to a funding formula that incorporates the enrollment of full-day 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds and funds them through its own formula. Right now, this program that is in current law is sort of an add-on. So we want to keep doing this for fiscal 20 and fiscal 21, and then, and I've referred to the big bill a few times, but this is sort of like the precursor to the full legislation that would reflect the policy recommendations and the updated funding formulas, which the commission has not completed yet. So that is what the commission will be working on for this interim. And so the idea is that at the next session, there would be a much larger and comprehensive bill that would include much more policy detail, if you can believe it, as well as the funding formulas. Then on the bottom of page 17, you may remember that last session, the General Assembly created a special fund to hold monies for implementation of the Kerwin Commission's recommendations. And in that fund, $200 million were deposited that reflect the excess income tax revenues that were received from the Federal Jobs Tax Act. That fund on the bottom of page 17 is being renamed to be the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. And then there are a couple of other amendments that just clarify. For example, you can see in line 30, the word final is being deleted so that the fund is available to fund the interim recommendations of the commission, which were provided in January, back in January. And then on the next page, page 18, the middle of the page there is another clarification, again with the final, and also since the funding formulas don't exist yet, we've just kind of moved the formulas to be in the future instead of currently. The next provision on the bottom of page 18 is another new program that the commission has proposed with a sort of interesting name called the Teacher Collaborative Grant Program. And what this is intended to do is essentially provide sort of a mini laboratory of partnerships between school systems, university teacher preparation programs, and the collective bargaining representative to sort of think outside the box and do some innovative things that the commission is proposing to be implemented statewide so that we can figure out what works and what makes sense to replicate around the state. And so the collaboratives grants, these would be provided by the Department of Education, would administer the program, working with the Maryland Higher Education Commission. And there is language on page 19 that in the middle of the page there has the purpose of the program, which is in 2 Roman 1, provide funds to develop state-of-the-art professional education for prospective and current teachers that reflects international and national best practices. And in Roman 2, award grants to multiple collaboratives in various regions of the state that will develop model professional development programs that can be replicated in school systems. And then there's an application process. And at the top of page 20, the Senate did clarify that you can see there are 3 parts of the grant. And as it was originally drafted, in order to receive a grant, you would have to be doing all three of these things: a 21st century practicum, which is a fancy word for student teacher, for teacher candidates to gain teaching experience in the classroom. The second is professional development for existing teachers, and then the third is a peer assistance and review program for induction and mentoring, and also teacher evaluation. So originally you would have to do all of those things and agree to do all of those things in order to get a grant. The Senate has said you have to do at least 2 of them, so not all 3. And then the next several pages provide more detail on, within those 3 subgroups, what a grantee would need to do in order to receive a grant. And you can see that the Senate added some language on page 21 related to what the professional development program would need to include, starting on line 17. You can see the amendments that they've added. But in general, the idea is that we want to make sure that existing teachers who are in the classrooms today receive the same sort of potential or updated training that we also want the teacher preparation programs to be incorporating into their programs for the new teachers. So that's the intent of this section. And on page 23, I will just point you to lines 23 and 24, where the Senate clarified that the intent is that there be an evaluation of each grant at least once during the grant period. A grant period in the bill could be 3 years. And there is $2.5 million on the next page, 24. There's $2.5 million that the bill requires or mandates funding for this program in fiscal 20 and 21. Of course, the fiscal 20 funding is contingent on the governor providing the funding or releasing the funding that has been restricted in the budget and the BRFA. And then the Senate also added an annual reporting requirement on the program. The next big piece of the bill starts in the middle of page 24. This is establishing an Office of the Inspector General for Education. The Inspector General is created as an independent unit of the state, and its purpose is to provide accountability and transparency in the expenditure of public funds for education in the state. And the Senate added all of this to the bill. On page 25, starting in line 7, it lays out the eligibility to be the Inspector General. In subsection B, it relates to not accepting appointment or being a candidate for state or local office while the person is the Inspector General, and for at least 3 years after the term of the Inspector General. There's also in subsection C, starting on line 20, the Inspector General is appointed by a majority vote of the governor, the Attorney General, and the State Treasurer, and it is also subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. The term of the Inspector General is 5 years, and reappointment and also removal is subject to that same majority vote. On page 26, in subsection E, the Inspector General must be professionally qualified through experience or education in at least one of 5 areas. law, auditing, government operations, financial management, or education policy. And funding and the salary for the Inspector General and for the office is as provided in the state budget. The next section of law on the bottom of page 26 goes into what the Inspector General's responsibility and authorities are. You can see in subsection A, the Inspector General, as it says, shall be responsible for examining and investigating activities in county boards, local school systems, and public schools, non-public schools that receive state funds. And there is also a provision that clarifies that non-public schools that do not receive state funds, the Inspector General is not authorized to investigate or examine. The MSDE is subject to the Inspector General, as well as the Interagency Commission on School Construction. And on page 27, in subsection B, the Inspector General may receive and investigate complaints or information concerning instances of fraud, waste, or abuse involving the use of public funds and property, violations of civil rights of students or employees, and whether policies and procedures governing the prevention and reporting of child abuse and neglect comply with federal and state laws, as well as compliance with other applicable federal and state laws. So that is sort of the universe of what the Inspector General is charged with doing or looking at. Subsection C talks about not disclosing the sources of information unless it is unavoidable. Subsection D deals with giving the Inspector General access to all the needed information and data. And you can see on page 28, there's references to confidentiality and attorney-client privilege, the ability to seek sworn testimony and issue subpoenas, and then the process that would occur. At the bottom of the page in subsection F, there is a provision regarding not taking retaliatory action against an individual who cooperates with the Inspector General. And on 29, in subsection G, the investigations are confidential and not subject to PIA request. In subsection H, if the Inspector General has grounds to believe that there's been a criminal violation, it should be referred to the appropriate law enforcement entity. And at the bottom of the page is an annual report, which includes referrals of potential criminal violations to all of those same entities. And I think that covers the Inspector General. I'm just going to keep going unless... All right. On page 30, starting in line 12, and going through page 31, this extends the Commission's reporting deadline to December 1st of 2019, and also extends the existence of the Commission through the end of the calendar year 2019. And since both the House and Senate bill were signed into law, it has to be amended twice. On page 32, starting in line 3, this is extending the deadline for the special education study that was authorized back in 2017 and just got started earlier this calendar year. So they need a little more time to complete their work. So this extends that date to December 1st of 2019 as well. In the middle of page 32 is, starting on now in section 2 of the bill, this refers to an Office of Program Evaluation and Governance Accountability that is being created in the Department of Legislative Services. There's separate legislation moving through the legislature. I forgot to check, but I think it might have already passed both houses. But this provision of law in this bill is contingent on the separate legislation being enacted. And so you can see that this unit would would actually have oversight over all of state government, but just the education provisions are included in this bill related to whether state and federal laws and regulations are being followed, and grading standards, graduation requirements, assessments, procurement, equitable use of resources. Section 3 of the bill on page 33 deals with another piece of legislation that is moving separately, Senate Bill 728 and House Bill 1301. That bill is in the Ways and Means Committee, I believe. This is commonly referred to as the Wayfair Bill. And what Section 3 of the bill does is it is sort of a belt and suspenders kind of thing. So Senate Bill 728 dedicates revenues that come in as a result of online sales tax revenues from market facilitators and out-of-state vendors to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. This provision in Section 3 in this bill is essentially doing the same thing. So that would make revenues that come in over $100 million each year would go into the fund that's dedicated to implementing the Commission's recommendations in the future. Section 4 of the bill, starting on page 34, deals with another new program that the Commission is recommending called the Teacher Salary Incentive Grant Program. This is intended to begin to raise salaries of teachers. The goal is to reach the average of our U.S. competitor states, Massachusetts and New Jersey. The Commission looked at their salaries, and ultimately the goal is to have an average salary that is similar to them. And so what this does is it provides $75 million in state funds for teacher salary increases. In order to receive the funds, a county school system has to give their teachers a salary increase of at least 3% for fiscal 2020. If they do that, then they are eligible to receive the state funding. And on page 37 and 38 is the allocations by county. These allocations reflect the state share of a 3% salary increase, wealth equalized. So on average, 1.5%, but for the wealthier systems, it's a little less, and for the less wealthy systems, it's a little more. If a school system provides a 3% increase and receives the grant, they have to use that money to raise teacher salaries above the 3%. The amendments that the Senate added, starting on the bottom of page 35, essentially clarify that a school system can apply for the money for fiscal 20 or for fiscal 21. So if a school system for whatever reason, does not receive the grant in fiscal '20, they are able to apply in fiscal '21. So they can plan, they can budget further ahead to provide that 3% salary increase and still receive the funds. As it initially was drafted, you had to provide the 3% increase in fiscal '20, and if you did that, then you could get the grant in both years. You also, to get the grant, have to maintain that higher teacher salary in fiscal 2021. There are also some amendments that just clarify, because we do have one school system that actually has started to implement a career ladder already. So there were some amendments that were needed to make sure that the bill incorporated their system as well as the traditional system. At the bottom of page 36, you can see where it, in line, starting in number 2, line 29, you can see where it requires the 3% salary increase. And then in number 3, it says in negotiating the use of the state grant, priority should be given to increasing starting teacher salaries and also the salaries for teachers with less than 5 years of experience. That is one of the commission's recommendations, is to increase the starting salaries for teachers to $60,000. And as we know, we lose half of our teachers in the first 5 years of their teaching experience, and so we want to try to target salary increases to the first 5 years. And I think that covers the teacher salaries. On page 38, section 4 is stricken here. It's just a technical amendment. Section 6 reappears later as another section. Oh, here it is, section 6. Bottom of page 39. So it has not gone away. And what this does is it provides $83,333 to each school system to provide to hire a dedicated mental health coordinator. That is the position that was required under the Safe to Learn Act from last session. So section 4 just becomes section 6. Section 5 of the bill provides additional special education funding to school systems above and beyond the existing state formula. And you can see about $65.5 million is being provided. The percentages that are shown on the bottom of 38 and on to 39, those reflect under current law in the special education formula the proportion of the grant of the funding that each county is currently getting. So we're distributing the funding in the same way that the existing special education funding is being delivered, and we're making a correction for Frederick County, you can see. And then in lines 19 through 24 on page 39, there is the Senate added language that essentially says that if any of these additional special education dollars are not needed for this by the school system to spend on additional special education services to implement IEPs and 504 plans, that the school systems have to use this money for other recommendations of the Kerwin Commission. So not just for anything is the idea there. Section 7 of the bill is on page 40. This is an amendment from the Senate that creates a work group to study MSDE and MHEC. You can see the work group has senators, delegates, and 3 members appointed by the governor, with the presiding officers and the governor jointly appointing the chair. And the work group is charged with making recommendations regarding the capability of MSDE and MHEC to carry out their current responsibilities and also implement the blueprint for Maryland's future. And that has a reporting date of December 31st of this year. Section 8 of the bill deals with what another program that the commission has recommended that is called transitional supplemental instruction, or you can think of it as tutoring. You can see on page 41 the struggling learner and transitional supplemental instruction are defined. And the Senate has added an amendment that includes screening, identifying, and addressing literacy deficits to the use of the funds. And in subsection B, $23 million is being distributed to the counties. These dollars were distributed based on the number of students scoring below proficiency in reading on the grade 3 PARCC. And the funds are intended to be used for literacy tutoring for students in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. There is language on page 42, starting in line 17. Well, actually, that's where the literacy is the priority for the funding. But below that, if a district, their students need the mathematics instruction as a priority, then the funds can be used for mathematics. Section 9 of the bill goes back to something I talked about a little while ago related to the compensatory education formula and the student count of students who are eligible for free and reduced price meal. In part because of the community eligibility provision and for other reasons, the counting students who are eligible for free and reduced price meal is becoming more and more difficult for the school systems. And so the commission was charged with making a recommendation on a different way of counting low-income students for formula purposes. And what the commission has recommended is that the state moved to something called a direct certification system, which is based on income verified federal programs that provide other assistance to students where the income is verified. Free reduced price meal equates to 185% of poverty. And so some of the other federal programs like SNAP have slightly different percentages of poverty that are used. In addition to direct certification, the commission is also recommending that Medicaid data be used. Medicaid has a couple of different cutoffs for income, one of which is very close to 185% of poverty. So it's a very good match for the same level of poverty family that we're currently targeting aid to. So in order to use Medicaid data, we have to incorporate into the new IT system that MSDE is developing the ability to capture the Medicaid data. And that is what this section is saying. And in addition, it is asking MSDE and the Department of Health to enter into an MOU so that data can be shared. On page 43, starting with section 10, there's sort of a series of uncodified sections of law here. Section 10 is intent language that the governor release funds that have been restricted in the fiscal 2020 budget. There's a total of $255 million in fiscal 2020 that is available to be spent under the bill. If the governor does not release that money, then Section 10 requires the governor to provide the funding in fiscal 21, in addition to all of the money that is mandated to be provided in fiscal 21 under the bill. That's Section 10. Section 11 is a reporting requirement for the LEAs to report in 2019 and 2020 on the use of the funds that are being provided through the bill and how they're implementing the policy recommendations of the interim policy recommendations of the commission. Section 12, the Senate has amended. This deals with funding for fiscal 2021 and 2022. In subsection A, the Senate has a total of $355 million that would be required in fiscal 2021. About $298 million of that is contained within the programs that I just described in the bill. An additional $57 million is required to be appropriated by the governor. That's for fiscal 21. For fiscal 22, the Senate amendment requires the governor to appropriate $370 million. And none of the programs in the bill go beyond fiscal 21. So a total of $370 million would be appropriated in fiscal 22, and in addition, $130 million would be required to be appropriated if the revenues are available as a result of legislation that's enacted either this session or next session that can be used to implement the commission's recommendations. So the 370 plus the 130 million would be a total of 500 million that would be mandated in fiscal 22 under the Senate amendments. Section 13 of the bill actually kind of goes back to another commission recommendation, which is that there be some outreach and training to teachers and parents and school board members and the public about what the commission is proposing, sort of the vision and the how it's different from what we do today. And there's $250,000 that would be provided to the State Department of Education to contract for that outreach and training. Section 14 of the bill expresses intent, this is a Senate amendment, intent that the commission in its final report include an implementation schedule that phases in the recommendations as evenly as possible over the phase-in period. The current phase-in schedule goes through 2030, but it is fairly front-loaded. The costs increase pretty dramatically in the first 4 years, and then it's a fairly slow growth from there. So this language is intended to have the commission take another look at the phase-in schedule and think about ways to make it a more incremental increase. Sections 16 and 17 are technical, and sections 18 and 19 deal with the contingency. So section 18 relates to the program evaluation unit, and so that provision of this bill is contingent on that separate bill passing. Section 19 deals with Wayfair bill and makes that provision of this bill contingent on that bill passing, and section 20 says the whole bill takes effect June 1st.
Very good. Yeah. There.
Thank you.
You want a standing ovation too?
No.
No.
Not necessary.
Not necessarily. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. And the other committee staff that have worked
Absolutely.
so hard on this
Kelsey and
bill.
Jody
Thank you.
Many people in the Twitter.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we have questions. We'll start with appropriations and we'll go back and forth. Who has a question? Delegate Hedelman?
Chair, I have a question with regard to the interface among Joint Audit, Inspector General, and new OPE, and how that works exactly. Yeah, if you could just clarify that.
So currently, both the legislative audit or the joint audit committee and legislative audits, and this new OPE unit are part of the Department of Legislative Services. So those are sort of one set of things. The current legislative audits are more financial compliance audits. This program evaluation unit will be performance-based.
But how does that differ from the Inspector General?
The
And-
Inspector General piece is targeted solely at waste, fraud, and abuse and certain other types of compliance with federal laws, state laws, reporting requirements, things like that, that are not, there's no education policy really involved in that. It's a more governmental use of public funds and property type issues. The program evaluation unit could look at some of those things, but I think the vision for that from our executive director is more program performance based as opposed to waste, fraud, and abuse type things. Efficiency in the programs.
We can talk more. Okay, thank you.
Delegate Feldmark?
Chair. Thank you very much for this this detailed walkthrough. A couple of questions came up. One, regarding the Inspector General, on page 28, lines 27 through 30, there's this provision about protecting against retaliation for cooperating with the Inspector General, but it says a state or local agency, county board, or public official may not. And I believe the Inspector General also has purview over private schools that accept state funding. So was there a rationale for not including the private schools, or is that, was that not discussed, or how was that?
I think that might be an oversight in the drafting, but I'm looking at Kelsey. Yeah, so
So it's page 28, lines 27 through 30?
right. So it says a state or local agency, county board, or public official may not take adverse retaliatory action against an individual. I think it would, to be consistent, you would want to add non-public school official.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was on the eligibility for free and reduced meals and looking at the direct qualification through Medicaid. Mm-hmm. Is that, so I just want to make sure I understood correctly. There's an income threshold that is comparable, so you'd be capturing essentially the same universe. What's the impact of students who are not citizens? Or
So that's definitely a challenge.
Okay.
Potentially using direct certification plus Medicaid, we might capture more students than the current way with the form. But either way, it's a challenge for students who are not legal citizens. And actually even for some who are here legally but are not citizens yet.
right.
What the commission has proposed doing as a way to address that issue is a little different. What the commission has proposed, and it's not in this bill, is for the English language learner funding, it's currently called limited English proficient funding. The funding weight or the amount of money per student that we provide through that formula, the commission is proposing to reflect in that amount an additional amount based on the current proportion of students who are low income, who qualify for, who are English learners. So we would build into the formula based on the current proportion, which is about 75% of English language learners are also low income. So the funding for that distributed through that formula to the schools would be higher to account for that need for services.
Okay.
And by doing it that way, we don't need to worry about the count anymore.
Right.
We also can never update it, but someday someone else will think of a different solution.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Beitzel.
On page 13, you have a provision there for each, except as provided in the subsection, each county board shall distribute directly to each eligible school an amount equal to $248,833. So that's every school that qualifies as a poverty school, regardless of enrollment or number of students, would get that amount. So it's an equal amount to go to every school.
Yes, because it's based on providing those two positions, which what the commission proposed is each school that is at this concentrated poverty level needs a community school coordinator and a full-time health care coverage.
And then it says further in 3 that local school systems that has at least 40%
40
eligible schools,
Right.
40 eligible schools. So in those jurisdictions where there aren't even 40 schools, they wouldn't qualify for any of that?
No, what this is doing, so generally, it says that the money has to go directly to the eligible school. So, right now, state funding formula aid goes to the county board, and the county board determines how it's distributed to each school. The state doesn't play any role in that. What the commission is recommending with this formula, this new grant program, is that the dollars are required to go to the school. The county board would not have flexibility about whether they gave a school that funding or not. But in a school system that has a large number of eligible schools, recognizing that there, when you have 40, or in Baltimore City's case, over 100 schools that are eligible, not that those dollars won't go to those schools, but that it might be spent in a more coordinated way across multiple schools. So it's really just to allow them to spend the funds efficiently, but they still have to show that the dollars were spent for students at that school.
Also, if I could follow up, Madam Chair, I brought this question up numerous times about in those counties or in jurisdictions that have schools with declining enrollment. I don't see anything in here anywhere that addresses that particular thing. Is there anything in here that I missed, or is there anything in any of these recommendations or report at this point in time that's done anything to address schools with declining enrollment?
Well, the bill does extend the current existing declining enrollment grant for another year. So that's in this bill. And then as part of the commission's work this summer, the commission did make sort of a preliminary recommendation to make the declining enrollment 3-year rolling average permanent.
Okay.
That's not in this bill. That would be in the big bill next session.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Patterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the overview of the Senate Bill 1030. My question has to do with diversity of teachers. I have not or could not find anything dealing with the potential or possible increase or incentives to have more minority teachers or diverse teachers in the classroom. Is this something that I've overlooked, or is this something that's planned for the summer work group?
I think Delegate Lutke.
Excuse me?
I think Delegate Lutke can answer that.
Thank you. So if you recall last year's bill that was the first bridge to Kerwin, included language requiring MSDE to start a program of outreach, and in particular called out the need to hire more minority teachers. So that's in the implementation phase right now at MSDE. The bill this year doesn't repeat that language because it's pre-existing language, but certainly, I mean, the Commission and the Ways and Means Committee see it as an ongoing point that we need to address.
Yeah. They'll be very fast, I promise. Is there? No, they are. The impact to the local governing bodies, I think the only fiscal impact is going to be the teacher salaries, correct, in this bill. Now, next year, that's going to change, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. See, I told you that was a fast question. And the second one, on page 43 and 44, where we're talking about the additional $500 million, it says it's contingent on additional revenues available as a result of legislation. I just want to be clear on what kind of legislation we're talking about.
So as a result of legislation enacted in 2019-2020 to implement the recommendations of the commission.
Are we talking about like increases in revenues, like new taxes and things like that, or higher taxes? Is that what we're referring to in that section?
It could be new taxes. It could be, for example, the Wayfair dollars that over $100 million are being dedicated to the commission fund would be part of that number. It could be just additional revenues.
And do we have any idea with that Wayfair bill about how much more above that $100 million that might be able to be applied to this?
Well, I can tell you that the Board of Revenue Estimates has projected $100 million for fiscal 20, and they think that number goes up to $125 million over the next 5 years.
So it'll give us about 25 out of the $500 million. Okay.
But there are others who believe that it's possible. It could be much, much more.
Gotcha. Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Delegate Washington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't necessarily have a question. I wanted to clarify the delegate's question about attracting minority teachers. We did include some language in the Kerwin Commission recommendations for scholarships and attracting, using that scholarship and having a participation goal of minorities be in the program of about 35%. Of minorities being involved in that program too. There's other things that we definitely need to do and explore more ways of attracting minority teachers to the teaching profession. So those are things that we did consider, but there's still more work to do.
And part of that, some of that was in last year's bill, and some of that will be in next session's bill. Exactly.
Delegate Krim.
Rachel, and thank you so much for being here today. And I want to talk a little bit about all the reporting that the locals are going to have to do. I understand accountability, and I think that is a prime component of the Kerwin recommendations, and I support that. But we have the Inspector General, we have program evaluation. On page 43, we talk about the locals providing these committees and the comparable Senate committees with information. So I'm wondering if that can all be combined somehow. Are we using the Inspector General's office to its maximum potential rather than have all these individual reporting mechanisms?
Well, in terms of reporting on accountability for this legislation, I think the only reporting requirement or the only new thing LEAs will have to do is report on how they're using the dollars in the bill to implement the commission recommendations. The Inspector General is only, I mean, whatever the Inspector General does is triggered by complaints, and so it wouldn't be like an regular reporting type of thing.
Okay, so that's complaint driven.
And then on program evaluation, that will be, I mean, the resource. I think there's transferring 6 positions from audits to the Department of Legislative Services. We're not talking about every LEA every year. It's 6 people for all of state government right now. So, that would be a extremely periodic thing.
I just have one more quick, page 37, where we had the numbers that for the teacher raises. I know they need to provide 3% first, but where did those numbers come from?
So a 3% salary increase costs about $150 million. So the state paying half of that is 1.5% or $75 million. But like pretty much all state funding, it goes out in a wealth equalized way. So the dollar amounts reflect the state's share of that money, wealth equalized.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question about the teacher salary incentive grant program. You said the goal, I think, is to get teacher salaries up to the average of Massachusetts and New Jersey. So I started Googling teacher salaries in Massachusetts and New Jersey, and I got 68,000 and 78,000 as the current averages, and so just wanted to try to get a clearer sense of what the specific number is that we're going for.
The number that we're going for is about $80,000.
$80,000, great.
And it's there. It's in the commission report. I can direct you to the page when I find it. But
That's great, thank you.
Delegate Corman.
Rachel, thanks so much for all your work on this. Senate Bill 1030, obviously incredibly important. There's another education-related bill that I think everyone in this room voted for that's sitting over in the Senate, HB 727. I know you're familiar with it. Maybe it didn't take quite as much time as this one, but quite a bit. So I look at Section 10, where we have intent language for what we do with money in the operating budget for FY20. And I know, thanks to the leadership of the Speaker and Chair McIntosh and Chair Kaiser, we have about $100 million fenced off for school construction for FY20 that's not yet accounted for. So could we include in this Section 10 intent language for that money as a bridge to HB 727? So using the allocation in HB 727 for that $100 million that's also in the operating budget fenced off, could we add to the intent language? You have intent language in Section 10 on page 43 for FY20 operating dollars.
Right. Yes.
There's also fenced off $100 million in unallocated school construction money in FY20. Could we add to our directions here?
it's actually $127 million of PAYGO funding for school construction in the operating budget.
Yeah.
Could you add
So-
intent language regarding that, use of that money to this bill?
Well, no, it would be for education. So it would be actually for the funding allocations in HB 727, the school construction bill. As sort of a, we've talked a lot about a bridge to Kerwin or a bridge to adequacy in my 5 years here. This would be a bridge to capital.
I would have to consult with the Attorney General to see if that would fit under the single subject rule.
Well, I think we have a few hours, so. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rachel.
Delegate Hornberger?
Where it talks about the teacher pay, I guess 37, 38, 39. A couple questions here. It looks like you're wanting to establish a baseline salary for all teachers across the state.
The commission has proposed, but it is not in this bill, that ultimately, that the starting salary for teachers in every jurisdiction should be $60,000.
Okay, and here, where I'm leading my question is, if I'm in a jurisdiction that chooses not to fund it in these first 2 years and doesn't go for the carrot that you've put here, if I have a neighboring jurisdiction that does go for that, and they're already paying a higher wage, as we have some counties that are adjacent to more wealthy counties, there's a very strong incentive now for my teachers to leave and go to a neighboring jurisdiction because you've now created a baseline 3% pay gap. Might it be as much as 10% pay gap for a neighboring jurisdiction? So I think, one, that creates a problem, but after 2 years, will that be remedied? If a county doesn't want to play ball here, what happens to those teacher salaries?
So I think you've laid it out very accurately, what would happen for the next 2 years.
Okay.
how the goal of raising teacher salaries is incorporated into the funding formulas and maintenance of effort, and, you know, whether that 60,000 starting salary is for every county or whether there is some sort of a tiering, are things that the commission is going to be looking at this interim.
Okay.
And so when we, next session, when we're working on the big bill, I should be able to answer that question.
Okay, but as written, would they still have to comply with the 3% raise after the 2 years of not funding it? Okay.
No.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Jackson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rachel, for your report. On page 42 and 43, you speak of the State Department of Education developing an information technology system that's currently under development. Is there a timeline on that system, and is that system in conjunction with the Department of Information Technology?
So the system is in development now. They have a contract. I think that, let me check on the timeline. I believe that it's intended to be operational for fiscal '21, but the addition of this provision to expand its capability, MSDE was working on figuring out what that would do to the timeline. So let me check on that. All IT projects are done with some consultation with the Department of Information Technology, but this is an MSDE IT project.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Buckle?
No.
There we go. So I had a question, or really two questions that are interrelated, specific to page 36 of the bill about the teacher salary incentive program. I'm trying to drill down, what is it in the short term? We've heard about the overall $60,000 or $80,000 goal, but the short term of this bill, the way I read it in section 2, subsection 3, line 11 and 12, it says that for the counties to qualify for this influx of state funds, they have to document that a total salary increase for teachers of at least 3% of a current fiscal year was funded in fiscal year 2020. And then in the next section, line 16, 17, it discusses what other increases, if the state grant amount specified is received. So my question is, and also down in line 29, a state grant may be used only to provide an additional salary increase for teachers above the 3% salary increase required in paragraph 1 in fiscal year 2020. So my question is, are we requiring the counties to fund out of their own share a 3% raise, and then they can access these predetermined amounts on the list on the next page? Or are we saying the county is going to fund roughly 1.5%, as you said, there's some variations from county to county, but the county is going to fund roughly 1.5% of a 3% raise, and then all of these amounts on the sheet is going to backfill that of 1.5 to add up to 3.
So ultimately, the commission's recommendation would be to, moving long-term, share the cost 50-50 between the state and the locals for the teacher salary increases. For this bill, because of the very short timeline for counties to be aware of the bill and then the increased local share, it was done this way so that because counties were already in the process of negotiating their teacher salary increases when the bill was introduced. So there's no way to know or to sort of hold anyone to, we were going to give teachers 1.5%, but now we're going to give them 3%. Or there was no way to sort of split it. And so rather than trying to do that, which was kind of impossible, plus require the counties to, on top of whatever they were planning, an additional 1.5%, with the state kicking in the 1.5%. Just for these 2 years, it is structured as more of a carrot.
Okay.
Where if you give a 3% increase, all in, COLA, increment, step, whatever.
Everything that.
Then you can access this additional money.
So this 75 million isn't contributing to your average teacher in Allegheny County or Montgomery County or Talbot County getting their 3%. This 75 million is on top of if they already got the 3% under their current existing system from their county.
Yes, although hopefully the existence of the 75 million is encouraging counties
To get them to
get
three. So the 75 million, and I couldn't do the math, and I wouldn't ask you to do it either, but if the 75 million, if we top that on top of somebody's 3% increase, the average teacher in those counties that do the 3% and then access the 75 million carrot,
Would be
their
4.5%.
salary increase is going to be above 3%.
Statewide, it would be 4.5%.
It would be 4.5% raise for everybody. The only other question I had, and I don't mean to belabor the time, what happens to the money on this list? You know, my county, it's just shy of $1 million. What happens to the $1 million that the state has allocated and mandated if Allegheny County says, can't do it? I can't afford to give a 3% raise this year. Where's that $1 million go?
So it will not be spent, so it will sit in the special fund that it comes from, which is either the Education Trust Fund or the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund. So it will stay.
Be spent somewhere else.
It can't be spent somewhere else. So it will stay in the fund, and it would potentially be available to spend next year out of the special funds for implementing other commission recommendations. But also the Senate amendments allow, if your county doesn't do it this year, but they plan to do it, they can access the money next year, which would still save money in fiscal 20.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Learman?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel, for working on this. I want to go back to where Delegate Jackson went to Section 9 on pages 42 and 43 about this system that MSDE has been developing because, as you know, we've talked about they did an RFP last year to develop this direct certification system and got responses back. But unfortunately, the RFP that they put out, it didn't include an option to use Medicaid data for direct certification. And I'm really glad we're including that here, but there are a number of other data methods that we could be using that their RFP did not include and that other states do include. For instance, the homeless management information system, they are not able to count homeless kids. There's no data sharing with the Head Start database in the RFP they put out. It doesn't appear to include data sharing with coordinating services for migrant students. And so I think it's really important to push them to do the Medicaid. But I would also say that they should also be having the flexibility to count homeless kids and migrant children as well. I know that this doesn't address the issue that Delegate Feldmark raised, but just making sure that that system can be adaptable to include more categories as the federal government allows us to use more categories, I think is important. And finally, one other thought is that we brought this up in a joint committee to end homelessness hearing, that the MD Think program that's being created by DHS, this system that MSDE is creating really needs to have some ability to talk with MD Think to get data from that. So you're nodding. So I don't know if that all needs to go into this language, but those are points that have been raised with MSDE before that they've ignored. So I just hope that we can push them to do that. Thanks.
sorry, Delegate Mosby?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, as always. My question today is not going to be specific to the concentration of poverty formula that we always talk about, but if you could turn to page 13, lines 21 through 25, it basically outlines that if a local school system has at least 40 eligible schools, the county board may, on behalf of the eligible schools, expend the funds distributed by the state under this paragraph, provided that the plan is developed in consultation with eligible schools that ensures that the requirements of subsection D of the section are met. So does that basically say that if a school system has 40 or more schools, that the school system kind of is the aggregate of all those funds? They dispense the funds out to the individual schools, and maybe for like a trained clinician that would be required under that section, you could have one for multiple schools. If that is not the case, why do we specifically call out that they kind of aggregate the funds and then dispense them out by their own discretion?
Well, it's not their own discretion, because that's why it says that they have to ensure that the requirements of subsection D are met. And D says you have to make sure each eligible school has community school coordinator, the health care coverage, and that any additional funds are spent that aren't needed for those things are spent on wraparound services and the needs assessment that I talked about.
Understood, but it's not unique. So, to that same example, if I have in a place that has that's highly dense, has a high density, like say Baltimore City, we have like 3 schools in one neighborhood.
Right.
They could meet all those criteria with the same individual?
Right.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes, that is the intent of the language, is to allow the sharing of the resources across multiple schools, so that they could share a position, they could share, perhaps you're going to do certain types of counseling with students from more than one school in a neighborhood. That's what that language would provide.
Thank you.
It would allow the school system to do that.
Thank you.
Delegate Portman. Go ahead. You got it?
All right, thank you. Question, just clarification on page 12, I believe it was, or 11 going to 12, about the eligible schools. You indicated before about the 80% for free and reduced lunch, and then you mentioned something in some of the farther out years that it would go down to 70 or 55 even. I didn't see what that's actually articulated in here. Perhaps it's somewhere else I'm just not familiar with, and I was just
It's
trying
not
to...
in the bill.
Okay.
It's in the commission report.
Okay. All right, so it's just
So
80%?
that would be in the big bill for next session.
Okay.
The phase-in to get down to the 55% threshold.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
Delegate McKay. Delegate McKay? Oh, my goodness. That was the politest. Yeah, just start talking.
So, rock on, Rachel. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Hey, he's a good guy. So on page 9, line 6, it's talking about a strong system of accountability. So is that definition found anywhere else in the code? Is that new language?
I'm sure it exists in other places, but I don't think it's defined.
So, what I would take from that is that the audits that are going to be performed would be that strong system of accountability, at least the way I understand
Commission's
it.
recommendations, which, again, are not fully in this bill, they would be in the next session's bill, are to create a new independent entity that would have oversight over the implementing all of the recommendations of the commission, that would sort of monitor implementation across MSDE, higher education, CTE, and dollar. And so that is what the commission has recommended.
Okay, and obviously they're going to be working on that in the interim for next year and all that kind of stuff. Was there any, in the commission, was there any directive of punitive action that may occur from these audits? There's one thing to point out violations, but if there's no teeth, there's no punitive action. Did the commission talk about that? And will that be part of the interim?
The commission has definitely talked about that, and as the interim recommendations stand now, the commission is proposing that in the future, if a school system is not implementing the recommendations as intended, that there could potentially be a withholding of funds.
Okay, because I think the public is having a perception issue with local governments and local entities and audits and things not being done, quote unquote, full transparency, but yet then nothing is happening to that. So we have to have 100% buy-in from the public if we're going to actually make this work. So thank you, and rock on.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, I'm seeing that this briefing, thank you very much, Rachel, took us an hour and a half. I believe the EHE yesterday took 4.5 hours to go through this, so I commend both committees on moving faster on this. For the Ways and Means, we're going to